Jonathan Israel has written on Dutch and Spanish history, the Age of Enlightenment and European Jewry. He was appointed professor of modern European history in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, in January 2001. He was previously professor of Dutch history and institutions at the University of London. His books include European Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism, 1550-1750, The Dutch Republic, Its Rise, Greatness, and Fall, 1477-1806, Radical Enlightenment, Philosophy and the Making of Modernity, 1650-1750, Enlightenment Contested, Philosophy, Modernity, and the Emancipation of Man, 1650-1752, and another title about another book on Spinoza in Dutch, which I cannot pronounce, A Revolution of the Mind, Radical Enlightenment and the Intellectual Origins of Modern Democracy, Democratic Enlightenment, Philosophy, Revolution, and Human Rights, 1750-1790. His recent work focuses on the impact of radical thought, especially Spinoza, Bayle, Diderot, and the 18th century French materialists, and on the Enlightenment and emergence of modern ideas of democracy, equality, toleration, freedom, and the press, and individual freedom. I know he just got contracted to write a book on the American Revolution in its global context, and he has a lot of other projects lined up. I really personally, and I'm sure I'm speaking on your behalf, extremely excited in welcoming Jonathan Israel to the podium.
Well, thank you, Anouar Majid, for inviting me to speak here this evening at the Center for Global Humanities. Thank you, everyone, for coming to listen, and I hope very much that I'm able to give the kind of talk which leads to some discussion afterwards, because I think that those are the most worthwhile kind. So I'm going to speak, most of the detail will be about the French Revolution, but I want to try to set the human rights aspects, perhaps the most valuable aspects, let's put it that way, of the French Revolution in a wider setting, and relating it also somewhat to the American Revolution, because I do think, although we scholars mostly assume, the American Revolution is one thing, the French Revolution is another, they're not that alike, maybe even it's often assumed they're fundamentally different, but actually it's extremely unusual, and it's happened very little, that there are detailed, systematic comparisons of the American and French Revolution. So let me just begin with a few general remarks about the American Revolution and its relationship to the French Revolution before I get into the detail. Remember that the success of the American Revolution between 1775 and 83 raised great hopes in many countries during the 1780s, even if its achievements so far seemed rather limited to some critics and a little narrower than perhaps they should have been. And there was a lot of serious debate. It certainly was very inspiring, and people were very enthusiastic in France and in other European countries by the enlightened, libertarian, democratic, and religiously tolerant outcome. But there also seemed a fair bit to criticize. Black slavery, after all, continued for some years after 1783, even in some northern states. Actually, New Jersey was by far the worst of the northern states. The number of slaves actually doubled between 1770 and 1800, which is rather amazing. In New York, it remained stable, and in most of the other northern states, it declined. But, of course, it didn't disappear rapidly, or as rapidly as some people hoped it would. With the advent of popularly backed democratic movements in the early 1780s, remember just before the French Revolution, there were these democratic movements in Holland, in Geneva, in Switzerland, and also some democratic agitation in England. So there were a lot of people who were responding to what had happened in the United States and were enthused by it. In 1784, for example, the great Welsh political thinker Richard Price, 1723-91, described the American Revolution in an address translated shortly afterwards into French by Mirabeau, who was one of the key leaders, of course, in the early stages of the French Revolution, as a revolution in favor of universal liberty. That I find very important. The American Revolution is a revolution in favor of universal liberty, a revolution which opens a new prospect in human affairs and begins a new era in the history of mankind. A revolution by which Britons themselves will be the greatest gainers if they are wise enough to improve properly the check that has been given to the despotism of their ministers. Meaning political ministers, of course, not the religious ministers. Price was one of those late 18th century British democratic radicals like Tom Paine, Joseph Priestley, John Jebb, Jeremy Bentham, and Mary Wollstonecraft, who believed that the British system and empire as it flourished in the late 18th century, however successful many people claimed it was in economic and political terms, nevertheless, it did not work to the benefit of the majority of people. To British as well as American Democrats, Britain then was a corruptly monarchical and aristocratic constitutional monarchy, relatively tolerant, no doubt, compared to most European countries, but a place where the aristocracy controlled politics and policy and the armed forces and diplomacy, and where toleration was incomplete and the Church of England too privileged. In his observations on the importance of the American Revolution and the means of making it a benefit to the world, London 1785, Price explained that the American Revolution conceived as a world event, the American Revolution he wanted to see would introduce democracy and equality on all sides, beginning with the United States. Remember that except for the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, which did grant universal male suffrage, actually none of the other 12 states, or if you count Vermont, which joined the Union pretty early on, 13 states, none of the other 13 adopted universal white male suffrage, let alone any other kind of universal suffrage. There were qualifications and also religious tests for office holding, which these radical thinkers were often rather critical of. But in creating the expectation of a better and more fulfilling life for all, I think especially we, the modern reader, needs to take special note that the planners and backers of the movement which they wanted to see develop from the American Revolution, Tom Paine, that famous figure, actually uses the phrase which I like very much, the general revolution. What the American Revolution did was it initiated the general revolution, which is the foundation of modernity in terms of human rights, democracy, and full toleration. But it didn't do it. It left the job only partially completed. It didn't complete the job. That was the essence of their criticism, and there was quite a bit of it in Tom Paine, in Price, in Bentham, in Priestley, and so on. There was disappointment as well as enthusiasm. Now, leading publicists and spokesmen for democratic revolution believed in a way that we've either forgotten about or somehow lost a sense of its significance, that a meaningful, positive, and worthwhile revolution, such as the general revolution, that Tom Paine and the others thought that the American Revolution should be initiating in the whole world, can only be born of and nurtured by the Enlightenment. So that's absolutely foundational and central to their thinking. Our first concern, insisted Price, at a banquet celebrating the beginnings of the French Revolution held in London on 4th of November 1789, as lovers of our country, must be to enlighten it. Why are the nations of the world so patient under despotism? Why do they crouch to tyrants and submit to be treated as if they were a herd of cattle? Is it not because they are kept in darkness and want knowledge? Enlighten them, and you will elevate them. It is by giving men just ideas of civil government and letting them know that it is an expedient for gaining protection against injury and defending their rights, that we can fortify them against submitting and remaining subservient to governments which, like most of those now in the world, are usurpations on the rights of men and little better than contrivances for enabling the few to oppress the many. Pretty strong stuff. Well, of course, the French Revolution promulgated an amazing sequence of stunning enactments and declarations, the most famous of which is this one, the Declaration of Rights, the Rights of Man and the Citizen, 1789. And what I want to focus on in this talk on the French Revolution is those aspects of the French Revolution that can be seen as being, in a sense, part of a joint project together with the more idealistic aims of the American Revolution. And, most social historians would perhaps interrupt me at this point and say, oh, yeah, of course, that's all very well, but social historians know, everyone would agree, no one would disagree with this, that there were 101 causes of the French Revolution, all kinds of things were going on in France in the 18th century. But the fashion amongst historians in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's this that I've been trying to counteract a little bit, if I can, has been, ever since Robert Darnton started this process in the 1970s, has been overwhelmingly to stress the social and cultural aspects of the revolution, and forget about the intellectual history of the revolution, the ideological side of the revolution, which I would argue is so crucial that you can't actually understand the shifts from one political group controlling or trying to manage the revolution to the other. Of course, there are a lot of factional shifts within the French Revolution, but you can't understand any of that. And historians often don't really go into too much detail about that, because looking at crowd movements or looking at the social history, however important that is, of course, you've got to know a good deal of that too to follow what's happening in the French Revolution. But the one thing that the different factions agreed about is that the crowds mostly were utterly bemused by the different ideologies, and usually were in considerable confusion as to what was actually going on. You've got to look at the leading groups, the journalists, the editors, the speech makers, the leaders in the political clubs, and so on. And you've got to follow closely their rhetoric, the way they expound their ideas, what their key central ideas are, and how the different ideological groups are competing in order to follow what's happening in the French Revolution. There really hasn't been very much of that. And so although we've got 1,000,001 books on the French Revolution, we don't really have a clear account of its intellectual history and the way the French Revolution fits together with the Enlightenment, which is really the central theme of what I'm saying this evening. So everyone knows that without the financial crisis, for instance, of 1789, Louis XVI wouldn't have convened the Estates General, and the royal government wouldn't have started to lose control of the political scene in France, and many other things wouldn't have followed. But of course, there was the financial crisis, and the king and his ministers did lose control of the political scene in France. But what I really want to focus on is the rather amazing circumstance, simply because there is a political crisis all the time, of course, and breakdowns of governments. But how so powerfully does an Enlightenment ideology come to the fore, as it did in France in 1789, which not only presented France, and it was explicitly couched as a document for the whole of humanity, not just for the French. And it was Mirabeau, who was one of the main movers, together with Brissot, whose portrait I'll show in a moment. They do explicitly say in their speeches and newspaper articles about the Declaration of Rights, which was concluded, of course, in August 1789, that they were inspired by the American example. That was very important, but they wanted to go slightly further and to broaden the rights that the American Revolution had embodied. And they wanted to present a document which was universal in the sense that it applied to the whole of humanity. It wasn't intended just to be a declaration of the rights of man and citizen directed simply at the French. So the best way to start, I think, if one really wants to understand what happened and what the French Revolution was about, is to look at the main vehicles of the new ideas that not only were going to embody in this broader way the rights of man and the citizen, but what's so amazing is that many of the key newspaper editors here in this, I've shown this print as the second because it very interestingly tries to depict in a visual way the leading newspapers and newspaper editors of the early months of the revolution in 1789. There's Brissot, who I mentioned just now, Gorsas, the Révolution de Paris, which is a very, very important paper. There's the Chronique de Paris, another very important paper, and so on. This it's dated from 1791, very correctly, I think, is indicating that the newspaper editors were playing a leading role in shaping the revolution. And many of the editors become deputies quite quickly in the National Assembly, and as in the case of both Brissot and Condorcet, who was one of the philosophes who became intimately involved and very prominently involved in the revolution, but was also one of the leading newspaper editors, soon become one of the leading politicians and statesmen of the revolution. So the royal press censorship in France disintegrated completely with the storming of the Bastille in July 1789. And all these newspapers which sprung up, one or two of them have begun tentatively just before July 1789, but basically all these newspapers are the product of the collapse of royal authority, the loss of control, the storming of the Bastille. So suddenly you have freedom of the press, and not surprisingly, freedom of the press was one of the most important principles that they emphasized and stressed, and which was embodied in the Declaration of Rights. And they wanted a completely free press, completely free theatre, by the way, which, as they pointed out, although Britain claimed to have a free press, it wasn't fully free because of the way the stamp duties and libel laws were used to enforce indirectly certain restrictions, especially on the way critics talked about the government or the Crown or the Church of England. So there were limits on freedom of the press in England. And what was very much different between the freedom of expression that was introduced by the French Revolution in 1789 and the existing position in Britain, as all those British writers would immediately agree, was that there was absolutely no freedom of the theatre in Britain. That was the theatre performances, precisely because crowds of people sat together and often got rather emotionally involved in plays were shown. It was realized that this could have quite an electrifying effect on masses of people, that you needed to be careful with theatre. So theatre in Britain in the 18th century was heavily controlled by the government, and there was no such thing as freedom of expression on the stage. Whereas in France in 1789, you have complete freedom of expression on the stage, and it was regarded as one of, a bit like in the Egyptian revolution in the last few years, that freedom of the theatre played a very important part in the way the revolution developed. Reconstitution of the legal, religious, educational, cultural, and political foundations of French society, along with the general emancipation of all minorities and abolition of slavery, were seen as a kind of package logic. They were interlinked, simultaneous, and comprehensive. The revolution denied the validity of ideas, customs, institutions, or laws inherited from the past, denied them absolutely and in toto. I don't think this had ever happened before in history, and in that sense the French Revolution, of course, went beyond the American Revolution, and it is a very strange thing. It's the only, even the Russian Revolution didn't quite to the same extent say every law, every institution we regard as inadequate and imperfect to the extent that it has to be thrown out. We don't think any single thing that we have in our education, in our politics, in our legal system, none of our institutions are adequate or can be kept. They all have to be thrown out, and everything, without any exception, will be replaced. That's rather extraordinary, and I think this is the only time it has ever happened. You can see from what I'm saying, you see from this point, I think, the logic of the contention which I'm making, that although there are many, many causes of the French Revolution, understood as a sequence of really electrifying enactments and laws which transform the character of society and lay the foundations for our modern society. Not only is this part of a joint exercise together with the American Revolution, but it is also true, I think, that one can see from this that the democratic Enlightenment, the more radical side of the Enlightenment, is the only big cause, the only major cause of the French Revolution in the sense of major factor that shaped the course that it took. I should explain at this point, because people, I often see furrowed brows and people looking slightly perplexed, because of course, it's been a very important part of modernity also, to give the French Revolution as bad a reputation as we can. And what happened later on, of course, deserved a thoroughly bad reputation. I'm not in any way defending Robespierre or the Montaigne or the Terror. Those were all terrible and ghastly things. But what is often not emphasized enough in the history books is that is an entirely different group of people who were expounding an entirely different ideology to the people that I'm talking about, the people who introduced the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, most of whom, by the way, were already Republicans at that stage. It's perfectly true, as historians always emphasize, oh yeah, practically everybody in France in 1789 was a monarchist, almost no republicanism. The republicanism came in only later. That's true if you count up numbers of heads in France, and there were more than 20 million people in France. But if you look at the intelligentsia who are behind the revolution, if you look at the newspaper editors, the journalists, the group in the National Assembly who were called the philosophes, who by the way, were often much resented especially by the businessmen and lawyers, who didn't like the way these intellectual guys were kind of taking over the machinery of the revolution. So I'm not talking about society in general. I'm talking about the people who dominated the revolution until June 1793. Robespierre and his awful friends do not take control of the French Revolution until the coup d'etat of June 1793. So that's quite a long time after the revolutionary process began. And they never, ever claimed to be part of the same ideology. They were not concerned with the same things as these people, as Mirabeau and Condorcet and Brissot. They never said that they were friends of those people. They never agreed with any of their ideas, and they never claimed to be part of the same revolution. Actually, there are three revolutions in the French Revolution. There is the what you might call the liberal monarchist revolution, which tried to, and to some extent in 1690, and although it was defeated in 1789, the moderate revolution, which greatly admired Montesquieu and the British model. The liberal monarchists said what we should do is try to be like Britain. What we really need is a society dominated by aristocrats, where the aristocracy run everything, with a good solid monarchy which has got plenty of influence and plays a large part in the constitution. The king has to have retain quite a lot of power, and we certainly don't want any of that democratic stuff. And that was quite an important faction within the French Revolution. So that's the first French Revolution. Although it lost the tussle in the later months of 1789, does come back quite strongly and is actually quite dominant. The Constitution of 1791 was a liberal monarchist constitution. So they seemed actually to be winning the battle at one time, 1791-90, but then the tide went back more towards the Brissotins and Condorcet and the Democratic Party, late 1791, 1792. The uprising in Paris of August 1792 reinforced the position of the democratic Republicans. The liberal monarchists were really out of the picture. And it became, after August 1792, the revolution developed into a battle between, let's call them the party of the Enlightenment, the democratic Republicans, and the authoritarian populists, who, if anyone's interested, I'll explain how different their ideology was in the question time afterwards, but I don't want to say too much about those people for the moment. They were in any case, not very important in the early stages of the revolution. They were very much in the background. This is a slightly irreverent print. There's Louis XVI losing his power. In fact, he's being kicked over by the angel there. And what is happening is that royalty and monarchy is being replaced. And this is how most people explain the French Revolution in the early stages. There's something we've lost a sense of what that means, and I think we find it very difficult to understand. What does it mean to say that King Louis XVI was being replaced by philosophy as the ruler of France? This was pretty obvious to people in 1789 because they were so steeped in the influences and the rhetoric of the Enlightenment. And it was, you only have to, anyone who's read the newspapers that I've been talking about, the pro-revolution papers of 1789, knows that it is full of radical Enlightenment rhetoric. Mirabeau and Brissot and Condorcet and so on, Prudhomme, the editor of the Révolution de Paris, and Gorsas, who we saw in the print just now, and Louvet, and so on, Carra, all these important, almost without exception, they're all Republicans. They're all radical Enlightenment people. They all want full freedom of the press. They mostly also belong to the Amis des Noirs. They're interested in the movement to integrate the free blacks into French society and to end slavery. They're interested in turning France into a democratic republic. And one of the most important principles, though I won't get time to talk about this, but I don't think it really needs much underlining. Everyone in the room probably can very clearly understand how revolutionary this was and how fundamentally important this was, that they were committed to, for the first time, I think, in human history, to universal education for everyone, boys and girls, that would be state-organized and supported and not controlled by religious ministers. So it was rather secular, their conception of universal education. That was one of their most important principles. So those are the sorts of things that were meant by philosophy. Even though Voltaire, of course, was the friend of kings and aristocrats and not exactly a representative of radical enlightenment, he, as the most famous philosopher, his image was often used as a kind of emblem for the way philosophy had taken over the country. And this is one of the prints that illustrates this procedure. And here's a stanza. I should say that and this fits in with the way I began the lecture. Of course, British historians often say, of course, there was great rivalry between France and Britain, and nearly everybody in Britain was extremely antagonistic to the French Revolution. That's true, of course, and there was tremendous loyalty. What the British wanted was their king and their aristocracy and their patriotism, and they absolutely rejected and were very happy to fight the French Revolution in a terrible war ensued. Well, that's true for most people, but it absolutely is not true, with one or two exceptions, like Edmund Burke, for the great historian Edward Gibbon was also rather a reactionary type. But as far as I can see, the conservatives that supported the government and let's say, the mood of the general population in Britain against the French Revolution seemed to be only a minority of the poets, intellectuals, literary people, mostly. And all those figures that I mentioned before. And another one that I didn't mention, Helen Maria Williams. I'm going to say more about women writers because that's an important part of the thesis that I want to lay before you in this talk this evening. In fact, Helen Maria Williams moved to France and Paris in order to be part of and to share in the revolution. But so there was great, amongst the poets, the literary people, or at least a large proportion of them in Britain, the writers, the thinkers, there was great enthusiasm for the French Revolution right the way through until the Robespierre people took over. I mean, they knew very well that he was the enemy of Enlightenment, the enemy of all the intellectuals, and was out to do them in, which he did, of course, pretty systematically. And but that's another story. As I say, that's a different French Revolution. Or as Jefferson, actually, I saw this. I hadn't seen this in one of Jefferson's letters till very recently, when he was an old man writing to John Adams. Quite rightly says, because Adams was making some negative remark about the French Revolution. Oh well, it was a pretty positive thing, and it was an effort that failed. But the man who ruined it, the man who wrecked the French Revolution, was Robespierre. Jefferson is absolutely right. Robespierre is not the man that made the French Revolution, as a lot of people think. Robespierre is the man who wrecked the French Revolution. And I think a lot of readjustment in our thinking about the revolution is needed to get that idea more clearly across. Anyway, philosophy was the theme of the day. And here's Helen Maria Williams, who wrote a long poem about the way the Bastille reinforced this vision of a new humanity, poem of 1790, and one of its closing stanzas is this: you see how philosophy is playing in this way a very active role. So the revolution's preoccupation with laying down fundamental new guidelines helps us understand why everyone in 1789 and subsequent years kept on saying that the revolution was caused by philosophy. But la philosophie, or la philosophie moderne, as it was often called at this time, enemies of the revolution often called it philosophism. Contemporaries, what they meant by this was, of course, not philosophy in general, but this new, more radical Enlightenment, Republican, anti-religious tendency that began with the Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert in the 1750s, continued with Rousseau's Social Contract, and continued in and after 1770 with D'Holbach's works, who I think had quite a big impact. Mably's volumes, not least on the American Revolution, and very, very influential in the late 18th century, although it's not so well known today. It should be better known than it is. It was the Histoire philosophique des deux Indes, which appeared under the name of Renewal for the first time in 1770 and was published more often, I think, than any other important 18th century book. There are at least, by 1795, at least 50 editions in French and 20 editions in English. Some of them in America. Was an exceedingly important and exceedingly well-known book in every country. There were translations into German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, even into Polish, which, as you know, was extremely unusual in the 18th century. The American Revolution is often cited as an example and inspiration for the French Revolution, and in speeches, in enactments, in debates in the National Assembly. And it was very widely thought in the early stages of the French Revolution that the two revolutions were closely related and, as I say, were two parts of what we can today look back on as a joint enterprise. So the revolution was above all a process of emancipation, democratization, and fundamental renewal on the basis of human rights, ruthlessly interrupted in 1793-4, it's true, by the Terror, and progressively aborted later by Napoleon. But this French Revolution does come back after Thermidor in a rather unsteady and damaged way between 1795 and 1799, until Napoleon was really able to consolidate his dictatorial authority over France. The universal principle of equality and the Declaration of Rights of Man, embraced in competing ways by all the ruling factions between 1789 and 99, were only finally discarded as the basis of citizenship and men's rights with the Constitution of 1799. Black slavery, abolished by the Revolution in principle in 1794, was reintroduced by Napoleon, of course, in 1802, and many other things were reversed, including some of the gains made by women. And I want to, as I go on, I want to make a number of points about the position of women in the revolution. But first, here is liberty armed with the scepter of reason, defeating ignorance and fanaticism. And of course, this you can understand from what I've been saying and the close connection between the democratic revolution, the enlightened revolution of the early years of the French Revolution, how important this theme was, that everything depended really on spreading understanding, on spreading knowledge of the Enlightenment, and on attacking ignorance and fanaticism, which were the things that had supposedly prevented, and surely there's a lot to be said for that argument, had supposedly prevented humans before 1789 from ever appreciating, understanding what their political and social situation was, how they were being cheated by groups that oppressed them, and how they were being denied their basic human rights. Now, the role of equality for women, the role of the early feminists, the role of women writers, the role of women's causes in the revolution is an extremely important one and requires a lot of emphasis. First of all, the idea, it's well known, of course, that there was a movement for, there were pamphlets, there were debates, there were meetings, and women's clubs were founded, especially by Etta Palm. We don't have a good portrait of her, unfortunately, a Dutch lady who'd been living in Paris from the 1770s and had become pretty well acclimatized to French culture. She was a very effective speaker and was the first really to organize women's groups and societies, not only in Paris, but there are newspaper reports of her giving these speeches also in Caen and Rouen and different towns. And a whole network of these women's groups was established in 1790, especially in 1791 and 1792. Again, like so many things in the French Revolution, this was completely reversed once the populist authoritarians took over. They said, we're not, everything that those people represented, we're against, we're going to suppress all of it, and we're certainly not having women involved in politics. That's not the proper role of women, and the women's societies were suppressed in the autumn of 1793. But there was, and of course, from that point of view, as a politically organized movement to obtain political rights and establish the idea that there was a claim to equality on political rights for women. It's true that nothing concrete was achieved in the longer run, and that in that sense, this aspect of the French Revolution was a failure. But what is often not realized is how much was actually achieved in terms of women's position and women's equality in relation to the marriage laws and the property laws. You only have to look at the legal system that applied in France in the 18th century before the Revolution to be horrified and shocked by all kinds of things, not only by the utterly unequal position of women in relation to their husbands or in relation to their fathers before they were married, but women, of course, had very restricted property rights and very restricted rights within marriage, and the position of women within marriage was utterly unequal. There's no question about that. Also, in addition to that, of course, the marriage was a purely religious sacrament down to 1789, so there's no sense in which it was a civil transaction. But all this was completely transformed. Mary Wollstonecraft is no doubt well known to everybody. She too moved to France, like Helen Maria Williams, and wanted to be part of this women's movement. And but it wasn't just fighting for better position for women by any means. They quite rightly saw the fight for women's equality as part of the general agenda for emancipation of mankind and equality in human society, and as an integral part of the whole radical Enlightenment battle for a democratic and equal society. They didn't isolate feminism and women's issues. However much involved they were with that, they didn't isolate the question of women's rights and women's position from the rest of the emancipation process. Olympe de Gouges, who was one of the most courageous and determined of the fighters for women's rights during the French Revolution, she was guillotined by Robespierre, absolutely typical of Robespierre's attitude to this kind of thing. But she also wrote plays, for instance, about oppression of the blacks in the French Caribbean, and abolitionist material which was aimed at strengthening the movement for abolishing slavery and for black emancipation. And Sophie de Condorcet, by the way, some people thought that she played an absolutely crucial part. She never tried, in the way that Madame Roland did sometimes rather upstage her husband. She didn't try to upstage Condorcet, who was one of the most of the important leaders of the French Revolution. I think the one that we've been unfairest to, and it's very strange that we've been so unfair to him, who's been most unfairly treated, given his extraordinary prominence and how little is discussed actually in a lot of the histories of the revolution. When you consider that the world's first democratic constitution was actually the French Constitution of February 1793, which was drawn up over the winter of 1792 to 1793, and mainly written by Condorcet. Well, that's not bad claim on fame. The man, the philosophe who wrote the world's first democratic constitution, that really is something, or ought to be something. But strangely enough, we don't have much regard for that. We kind of sort of tuck that away in a manner which is historiographically, which is really extremely odd and rather peculiar. Why that is given so little prominence and so little attention. But anyway, Condorcet was the chief architect, I would say, certainly one of the most important architects of the tremendous educational reforms of the early part of the revolution, and of promoting the principle of universal secular education for everybody. And that's actually a point where the populist authoritarians around Robespierre agreed that we should have schooling, but the boys and girls should be separately schooled and should learn different things. That was an important principle for them. Whereas Condorcet thought that the boys and girls should be educated together and should learn basically the same things. And it doesn't matter, he was very emphatic on that, whether the teachers are men and women. But a number of close observers at the time pointed out that Sophie de Condorcet did a tremendous amount to support, to strengthen, and maybe even help to guide some of her husband's initiatives, though she always did this in a rather discreet manner. And they worked together on behalf of women's rights. And quite a lot was achieved, because if you look at the reform marriage laws of 1792 and the French marriage laws of 1792 were brought in by this group and have absolutely nothing to do with the Robespierre people, you will see that for the first time in history, that the rights within marriage are made equal between both the property aspects and inheritance rights and other aspects of marriage. That marriage was made a civil contract, and, of course, something that horrified churchmen, they, as part of the civil contract, if you can make a civil contract, you can undo it if the parties agree, or if one of the parties wishes to. Therefore, the principle of divorce was introduced for the first time in France, and introduced for the first time anywhere as something that was accessible to anybody and everybody in the situation of marriage which was not working or which was an unhappy marriage. And what is so important, because they did keep the marriage laws and divorce under Napoleon, but they changed this part. What was so important in 1792 was that if there were complaints of infidelity or any other complaints within marriage, the rules applying to husbands wanting to divorce wives and wives wanting to divorce husbands were the same. Now, that is a tremendously important thing in 1792, and Napoleon wasn't going to keep that. So he said, well, we'll keep divorce, but husbands can decide about divorce and divorce their wives if they want to, and they can, if they can complain that their wives have been unfaithful, but wives can't do that about husbands. So they then made the marriage laws unequal again later. Now, Alain de Gouges, who we saw just now and who was guillotined by Robespierre, wanted to, one of her most effective ways, a satirical initiative to show people in a rather vivid way, just how unequal and despotic the relations between men and women have been. She published famous Declaration of the Rights of Women in the same number of articles as in the original Declaration of the Rights of Man, 17 articles. I've just put the first 4 there so as not to make it too crowded. So that's the Declaration of the Rights of Man, August 1789. This is Alain de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Women in 1791. Of course, was rejected by the National Assembly, but it circulated, and you can see from those first 4 clauses get some idea of the satirical and rather effective rhetorical style in which she couched these. So let's come back now to the major male representatives of this unrepresentative fringe, the Democratic Republicans. The first few, just a word about Helen Maria Williams first. Quite a lot of, besides the ones I've mentioned, there were a number of quite a lot of German, Georg Forster, Adam Lux, a number of important German intellectuals also came to France at this time. They wanted to be part of the revolution. They wanted to show their support for the revolution. But of the writers in English who were writing in France during the early stages of the revolution, I think nobody quite had as much impact in support of the French Revolution, apart from Tom Paine, of course, who was quite incomparable in his impact on both sides of the Atlantic, in the US as in Britain and Ireland too. Tom Paine had a huge effect in Ireland as well. But the other important writer writing on behalf of the revolution, also published in America, as you see from that title page in Boston, Volume 2 of her Letters from France. The Letters from France at that time were really very well known as an English language plea by a woman on behalf of the revolution. And this is, of course, the symbol of the French women, Françaises devenues libres, the idea that women were part of the revolution, that women were active in the revolution, and that women could achieve an equal freedom if they joined in the fight for these things. Now, coming back to the major male representatives of this unrepresentative fringe. At first, when the Estates General gathered in May 1789, there were only a small group, maybe a dozen or so, who you could call philosophes or supporters. But the great strength, I think, of this Parti de Philosophie, as it was called sometimes, the philosophic group, the radical Enlightenment group in the National Assembly, where they really had, maybe some other group, you could find a bunch of lawyers, there were 60 of them, and there were only 12 of these radical Enlightenment intellectuals at the beginning in May 1789. But your lawyers and businessmen didn't stand a chance, because these people had a tremendous advantage. They completely dominated the pro-revolutionary press. Brissot's paper, the Patriote Français, was one of the most important. I mentioned Carat and Gorsas. In fact, except for Marat's paper, which was the only one in the early stages of the revolution, L'Ami du Peuple, that supported the Robespierre people, the Montagnards, the authoritarian populists, they didn't have very much backing in the press. The pro-revolution press was overwhelmingly, I would say even, I don't think it's at all an exaggeration to say 90% of it was behind that group. They were also, in the early stages of the revolution, Brissot wasn't, in 1789, Brissot wasn't yet in the National Assembly, but he was in the Paris city government, as well as editing one of the most important newspapers. And this group of people were in a very strong position in the Paris Commune, or the Paris city government, as well as in the National Assembly. So when you look at the political clubs, at the press, the pamphlets, but especially the newspapers, Paris city government, and the National Assembly together, you see that this group were already making rapid progress in the summer of 1789. And in Mirabeau, they had probably the most spellbinding orator in the there were one or two conservative deputies in the National Assembly, the Abbé Maury, who were brilliant enough as speakers to stand up to Mirabeau, but that was pretty difficult. Mirabeau was such a tremendous speaker. So Mirabeau and Sieyès were perhaps the two most famous leaders of the Democratic, Republican, Radical Enlightenment group in the National Assembly, but Mirabeau was very difficult to stand up to. He was such a brilliant speaker, and he was so quick in his repartee and in his replies, which are always pretty brilliant. It was a very difficult figure to deal with, the leader of this group. So the Democratic Republican intelligentsia first captured the revolutionary press, the papers and pamphlets, which were the chief weapon of the revolution. And this only made them a more and more powerful influence in the National Assembly, and in later elections the bloc that the Brissotins by 1792 represented something like 200 deputies in the National Assembly, so they become a pretty large and dominant bloc at a later stage. So the guiding idea from once they lost their dominant position in June 1793, after that coup d'etat that I referred to, here's the people represented as Hercules crushing kings of December 1793. The emphasis amongst the populist authoritarians was very much, and here I think you can see how different an ideology it was from that of the Democratic Republicans. Their emphasis was very much on the idea that we don't need all that philosophy and all that intellectual stuff. The revolution should be based on the ordinary man. It's very anti-intellectual. Robespierre is always attacking rails against philosophes and the Enlightenment in his major speeches. And there were that aspect of, although that aspect of Robespierre's not very much emphasized by historians, who seem to be slightly embarrassed by this, that the fact that Robespierre was an enemy of the Enlightenment is not really underlined by modern historians, but in Robespierre's speeches it's very heavily underlined. But what's more important than that, I think, is the idea that not only we don't need the philosophy, we don't need all that intellectual stuff, it's only the ordinary person that counts. And there's only one really ordinary way of thinking about issues. The common people have one view. There's only one really ordinary view. And that has got to be crushingly dominant. It's got to be so crushingly dominant that we won't allow any dissent. There's only one view allowed, that the true people's view is an unbroken, uninterrupted unity, you could say. Therefore, we don't need all these newspapers, because there can't be any dissent. There's only one right way of thinking, and so that maybe we needed. It's interesting to listen, to read the speeches of some of these populist authoritarians after they take over in late 1793, explaining why freedom of the press is now going to be ended and they're going to shut down. All the newspapers criticizing them are going to be suppressed. in fact, no one is allowed to criticize them. That's actually the main reason why journalists, writers, editors, supporters of Brissot and Condorcet, why they're all, of course, Brissot was guillotined in October 1793. All the leading supporters of Brissot and Condorcet, when they caught them, one or two survived in hiding, were guillotined. And writers, I think, were amongst the foremost and most vulnerable victims of the terror, because they had been criticizing Robespierre and the people who had now taken over. You were not allowed, there's only one point of view allowed, and you're not allowed to criticize the government. Not only are you not allowed to criticize the government, we'll kill you if you criticize us, and that's exactly what these people did. It's quite interesting how they explain the shutting down of the press. Oh, well, when there were kings and there was too much church authority, of course you needed freedom of the press in order to criticize monarchy and aristocracy and ecclesiastical authority. So maybe freedom of the press had a role in the early part of the revolution. But now that we've won power, it means that the people's will controls the republic. The people's will is in power. Therefore, there's no room for criticism. Why would anyone criticize us? They shouldn't be allowed. There shouldn't be any criticism, and that's why we're shutting the newspapers down and ending freedom of the press. All very clear and very clearly spelled out. But of course, if you're not looking at the intellectual or ideological history of the revolution, you're going to miss all this, which is the real history of the revolution, of course. And historians have really got themselves so hooked on what they think are the social realities of the revolution that there's, as I say, as I keep saying, I'm sorry to repeat it, but I think there has been a very marked tendency to miss a lot of the main points, or not emphasize them, not bring them out in histories of the revolution, the things that really matter most to us, because of this well, it's a kind of fashion, a very dominant fashion. You just, ideas, intellectual history, we social historians know that is not important and it's not part of the French Revolution, and we're just not going to discuss it. So that seems to be something like the attitude, and it has had, I think, extremely damaging consequences for our understanding of the revolution. It's a very unfortunate fashion since the 1970s. Well, here's Marat, who edited the only newspaper that supported the authoritarian populists before they took over, L'Ami du Peuple. He is an interesting case because everyone that knew Marat described him as the most obnoxious and loathsome person you can imagine, and yet he became the figure of the first really great popular cult, you could say, almost a figure of general veneration, was built up into, especially when he was assassinated by Charlotte Corday in July 1793, became a kind of cult figure. Here is Robespierre, who also edited a newspaper, but I didn't include him amongst the major journalists in the early part of the revolution because because nobody seems to have read his newspaper, which is extremely boring, and I don't think, and it's so uninteresting. I don't think it really had much influence on anybody. It didn't deserve to either. Now, of course, just before the coup d'état, the rights of man was expanded by Brissot and Condorcet and their friends, by the Democratic Republicans. The February 1793 version was in 35 articles and expands a number of aspects, including freedom of expression and freedom of the press in a more complete and emphatic way than the earlier document. There's Marat after Charlotte Corday assassinated him. I don't think people should be stabbed to death in the bath. But if anyone ever deserved to be stabbed to death in the bath, then it was definitely Marat. Here is because Robespierre, the terror led to the guillotining of practically anybody of any prominence in the early stages of the revolution, because anyone associated with the earlier stages of the revolution was a prime victim of the terror. So in this print, you see Robespierre having executed everybody else, is now executing the executioner. And here, I'm going to draw the lecture to a conclusion by saying what you see represented in this print is the French Constitution, founded on the wisdom and immutable basis of the rights of man and the duties of the citizen, is shown as the world's first democratic constitution, which the Constitution of 1793, the Brissatin, Condorcet's constitution, as I mentioned, was February 1793. It was amended after the coup d'etat in June 1793. The constitution was amended somewhat, making it a little bit less democratic. But there was this is their most brilliant political move, because there was a revolt, an armed revolt against the authoritarian populists, especially in southern France, Lyon, Toulouse, Marseille, Bordeaux, Montpellier, all the major cities actually of southern France joined in this revolt, which became very disunified and rapidly failed during the later summer of 1793. But I think one of the main reasons that it never really got off the ground was this brilliant political move where the first thing that they did was to say, okay, the people want a constitution, and there's been this strong demand for a constitution. We're now going to put it to the people in a plebiscite. So there was the first plebiscite over constitution ever, which of course was approved by the population, and then almost immediately after it was approved by the population, Robespierre announced that the constitution was being suspended. But by that time, they'd got the upper hand over most of the rebels, and he could afford to suspend the constitution because, of course, it was never the intention of these people to put any of the constitutional provisions into force. That wasn't what they were concerned with at all. They were trying to impose a group dictatorship. So let me draw the lecture to a conclusion by saying that the French Revolution was really three revolutions. Two of them, the liberal monarchist revolution and the democratic republican revolution, can be regarded as aspects, parts of the Enlightenment, but the third one, that of the authoritarian populists, Robespierre and the Terror, is not part, has nothing to do, in fact was an enemy of the Enlightenment, and that the first two stages of the revolution that can be seen as part of the Enlightenment are closely akin to the two main dimensions of the American Revolution, because those that have looked at a certain conflict developed between Tom Paine and John Adams, for instance, between Jefferson and some of the more conservative founding fathers, those who thought that we'd achieved enough in America in 1783, that's it, once we have our independence, and then with the Constitution in 1787, you don't need more, that's the American Revolution. And those like Benjamin Rush or Tom Paine or Joel Barlow or quite a lot of others who not studied very much today, because I'm not sure why that should be. But anyway, those that thought the American Revolution was incomplete and hadn't done its job because slavery hadn't been abolished, because we didn't have universal education. Robert Coram was very keen on that, but all of these people thought that the legal system hadn't been reformed enough, and they had a number of other points that they thought, for instance, the removal of religious tests from office holding in the state constitutions, the whole list of things which they thought needed improving, which hadn't been brought about by the 1780s, but which they thought the American Revolution should bring about. And so, although in the American Revolution it's the moderates that won, that radical dimension was a very important part of it. And Jefferson to the end of his days, always thought that the American Revolution and the real French Revolution, if I can put Robespierre and the Terror to one side for a moment, were part of a joint enterprise. And I hope I've done something, at least in this lecture, to convince you that there's quite a lot of logic to that. And that has a lot of significance for us still today. Thank you very much for listening to me.
If you have any questions, please use the microphone.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very, very interesting presentation. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the different roles, apparently, to me anyway, different roles of women in the French Revolution, the original French Revolution, and the American Revolution. Because as you laid it out, it looks like the French women were very much engaged with forming their own women's-based Declaration of the Rights of Women. And I'm not aware of a similar thing in America, but maybe there was. But can you comment on that?
I need to know much more about that, and I'm not able to answer that question nearly as effectively as I'd like to be able to. I suspect there was quite a bit in the background. Certainly in the foreground, there is a very noticeable difference, because you don't have the same, formally, there's not the same movement in America as there was in France, which was, of course, strongly supported also by these British women, because not only Mary Wollstonecraft, but Helen Maria Williams was actually quite a prominent person in the French Revolution. I should mention in that context that I've studied quite closely an amazing event in November 1792, just before, a few months before war between revolutionary France and Britain began, when there was still no difficulty about movement between Britain and France, when the British Club in Paris organized a banquet to celebrate the achievements of the French Revolution, if you can imagine this, because this is the sort of thing that people were embarrassed by in Britain later, and they kind of covered this over somewhat. But there were 100 people at this banquet, including many. It's thought that Wordsworth may have been one of the people there. That's not quite certain. But certainly Tom Paine was there, and Joel Barlow was there, an American radical. They were British, Irish, and American. There were a number of Americans at this banquet at the British Club in November 1792. Helen Maria Williams was one of the presiding people over this amazing event, and in recognition of her role and that of the other ladies who had who were playing a prominent part in the revolution. I've studied in detail the 17 toasts. They're absolutely amazing toasts. Some of them are very humorous. One is that may the Marseillaise one day become the favorite marching music of the British Army, things like that, which one can't take too seriously. But a lot of them, for instance, may we soon see an end to princely despotism in Germany too, were very, very seriously meant. One was devoted to the emancipation of Ireland from British imperial control, but two of the toasts were celebrating the women's movement and those prominent ladies who had brought the women's movement to the attention of society in the way that they had by 1792. So that was really quite an impressive achievement. I suspect that this is quite widely known about in educated circles here as well. And there must have been, I think, women who knew about this and were aware of this, and there would be letters about it and perhaps comments in journals and so on. But I haven't studied that enough to be able to give us an effective answer as I'd like.
I very much enjoyed this, especially since it was from an intellectual point of view. You spoke about marriage. Given what's going on in our society with marriage in question, it's kind of interesting to talk about the epoch of change within secularism and religious authority. Can you open up about that, kind of tell us more about that? Because that's very interesting from a political point of view.
The solution which was probably most effective to the undoubted fact that religious authority, now I think the key word is not so much religion as religious authority, had exercised a control over society, over education, and over individual lives that many people felt was excessive in the late 18th century. The American solution was, of course, separation of church and state, disestablish the Anglican Church everywhere, as Jefferson, of course, did in Virginia, started this process very early in the Revolution. And people can believe what they want, they can join whatever church they want, but no church should have political leverage and the support of the state in enforcing its authority over people, that is a form of oppression or despotism, which is not part of the American system. That actually is exactly the same solution that the French Revolution also eventually came to after a lot of twists and turns, because this separation of church and state that you have in the United States was also adopted in France in 1795. But by that time, they'd gone through a very complicated sequence. The trouble was, of course, that there was no religious freedom in France at all before the Revolution. There was no toleration. The Crown had just got to the point of allowing a partial toleration for the Protestants, or more rights for Protestants than they had before, by 1787. But basically, it was a rather religiously intolerant society. Also, the church, of course, was very privileged in France and politically powerful, and it owned an enormous amount of property. And these revolutionaries wouldn't accept that, and began by reducing the privileges and powers of the church and confiscating their property. So the result was that the Catholic Church and the papacy opposed the revolution, and that immediately, of course, split French society in a fundamental way and caused something like a religious war. A large part of the Revolutionary War, and there was a tremendous amount of opposition to the revolution in France. But to a large extent, this was a kind of religious war of religious authority against the revolution. That's what it really was. And it went through the reaction of the revolutionaries is, of course, to retaliate in a more and more aggressive way until eventually, but that was not not Brissot, Condorcet, or the Democratic Republicans, and it was never something advocated by any of those newspapers that I showed earlier on. The de-Christianization as an intolerant, persecuting movement doesn't actually start till after and it couldn't do, because as I say, under the Democratic Republicans, you had complete freedom of expression, complete freedom of the press, complete freedom of conscience and belief, complete freedom of religious practice. And that was, despite all the tensions, that was respected. It's only, although Robespierre himself actually didn't personally agree with the de-Christianization campaign, that was more a lot of secondary people like Hébert and Clotz and a lot of other revolutionary leaders, but not so much Robespierre, in the authoritarian populist group, who then, once freedom of the press, it goes together, you suppress freedom of the press, you suppress freedom of expression, and you start this, they started shutting down churches. Also, those priests that protested too much were guillotined. They actively started persecuting the clergy, and that is a different thing from the secularizing campaign that you had in the earlier part of the revolution that I've been talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to reading your book when it comes out. So the question has to do with, I'm going to ask you to help me understand if I would be right in thinking that the resonances of the idea of the rule of law and of that expression, and not just an aspiration, but as a term that still to this day obviously has tremendous currency in the U.S. and gets deployed, with great frequency, that those resonances are different or more prevalent or than they are in France. And I'm interested in particular in the 1789-1793 period. I've never thought about it until now. I'm thinking, when I think of France today in the United States, the idea of the rule of law is one that resonates. And I'm not really aware or don't feel as though that has a kind of, that's translatable. So when we speak of le règne de la loi, I'm not aware that that gets talked about in much the same way. And so I'm trying to think what the equivalent, is there an equivalent enthusiasm? Is there, if these are kind of one project, how significant is that difference? I'm not sure if there's a question in there, if you can hear it, but
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of discussion about what the rule of law is, and why is it that the old law isn't to be respected? Isn't that the rule of law, the king's law? And so the question of rule of law gets very much tied up with the political thought, issues of political thought, like what makes the law legitimate, what makes legislation legitimate. And so it's directly connected with this argument that if you have a hierarchical society with privileged groups who are the only ones represented or who dominate the representative institution, the legislature, and that legislature enacts laws, that those laws can't be the will of the people as a whole. So what makes laws legitimate and what makes the law, the rule of law real, is that the legislature is elected by the people and it represents the will of the people. So in that sense, I can't see a big difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution in its democratic constitutional phases. They have the same idea that the legislature represents the people. It's representative democracy, and the legislature passes laws which are then seen as the will of the people, which is what makes those laws legitimate. So that the rule of the law is not something that anybody who respects society and the will of the people will want to challenge or rebel against. So again, there seems to me there's quite a close alignment, actually, between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and again, one can see them as a joint enterprise.
I'm wondering what the intellectual exchange was between the two constitution writers, two groups of people writing constitutions between the American and the French. Were they working in parallel, or was there really an exchange or an interaction?
Of course, Jefferson was not so much involved in the writing of the American Constitution, but he was, of course, in the Declaration of Independence and a lot of other important. What makes, of course, great difference, I suppose, between the American system and the French system is that the American Republic was a federal republic, and the French Republic was a unified republic. But the American the state constitutions were crucial examples and talking points for those that were framing the Constitution, also those that were opposing the Constitution, because you don't just have the Federalists, but there are a lot of anti-Federalists who are criticizing what they're doing in the 1780s. So there's an argument about the American Constitution from people who are perhaps more wedded to some of the principles in the state constitutions. But what's so interesting is that the American state constitutions are all translated into French and all very well known. One of the important points about Brissot and Condorcet, in addition to the other things I've mentioned, is that they were regarded as experts on Britain and America. And they were very much closely in touch. Well, actually, one of Brissot's closest friends, Clavier, had been in America. They were all closely in touch with people who'd been in America and had all studied the American state constitutions. That was very important to them and was equally part of the French constitutional discussion, just as it was of the American constitutional discussion. So I think that's pretty interesting. As part of your question, I didn't answer. Could you just, what haven't I replied to? Yeah, of course, a number of, Jefferson, of course, was in France in the opening stages of the revolution, was very enthusiastic about it in 1789. He was there till, I think, November 1789, and worked quite closely. Of course, Lafayette was an old friend from the American Revolution, and in 1789, when he was one of the people closely associated with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and with the more progressive wing in the National Assembly, Lafayette talked mainly like a Republican. Now, he was accused of backtracking in 1790 because he sort of shifted more to the center and joined the liberal monarchists. And in fact, by 1792, was a leader of one of the leading figures of the liberal monarchists. So Lafayette kind of, in a way, abandoned the more radical democratic side of the revolution. And what Jefferson thought about that, I don't know. I'd like to know. If anyone knows, please tell me. I need to find out about that. But there were many interchanges. Adams, of course, also spent a lot of time in Europe in the 1780s and early 90s, more in Holland and England than in Paris, but he was also in Paris for significant periods of time. And so were a lot of other prominent Americans. So there was quite a lot of toing and froing. And I think not only were the French extremely interested in the American Revolution, but something else which has been a little bit forgotten is that the only thing that happened outside the United States that American opinion generally, I don't just mean, professors and journalists and people like that, or politicians, but everybody, farmers in Kentucky, everybody was interested in the French Revolution and were very, very favorably disposed towards it. Even, strangely enough, or maybe they thought persecuting Catholic clergy wasn't so bad, I don't know, but the Protestant ministers generally were still very much on the side of the French Revolution, down to about 1796. The turn of the Protestant ministers against the French Revolution seems to be a phenomenon of the late 1790s and connected with the battles between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the US. That's an interesting phenomenon. But the subsequent history has to some extent obscured for us how very positive, in sharp contrast to Britain. Here is a really, really sharp contrast. In Britain, nearly everybody was against the French Revolution. In America, practically everybody was in favor of the French Revolution, till even after Thermidor, which is really rather remarkable. So it took a while for the full horrors of the terror to sink in. And the assumption was, amongst most people, and it has a lot to do, I think, with the point that I'm trying to make, that for most ordinary Americans around 1790, the French were following the American example and doing the same sort of thing as the Americans had done here. And I think that was a very widespread feeling.
We got a question from California, and this is from the Dean Emeritus of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of New England, Ted de Padova. Hi, Ted, if you can hear me. So, although their philosophical assumptions were very different, was there enough of an affinity between the radical thinkers, Condorcet, Mirabeau, etc., and the constitutional monarchists, Mounier, Lafayette, that enabled them to cooperate in 1789 and that set them both apart from the authoritarian populists like Robespierre?
Interesting. Well, first of all, in 1789, Robespierre and the group around him were not very important. Robespierre starts to gain some importance in 1790 to 91, but in the early stages of the revolution, I don't think Robespierre Marat's paper hadn't started yet. Marat and Robespierre and the other authoritarian populists were not an important group in the revolution in 1789. So there's only the liberal monarchists or centrists and the more Republican and democratic grouping. And I think that they did work together in part, and many of those who later joined the centrists opposed Mounier at first. So Mirabeau and Sieyès were very successful not only on the Declaration of Rights of Man and the abolition of feudalism, but a lot of major enactments on the reform of local government, for instance, many things that happened in the late 1789. Mounier more or less gave up, actually, and abandoned the National Assembly and emigrated to Switzerland at that point. So I think that Lafayette, for instance, was, as I mentioned just now, was much more leaning in the Republican direction in 1789 than he did later. So some people, Le Chapelier was another, moved more to the center at a later stage when that quarrel developed in 1790, 1791, more than it had done in 1789. So it seems to me that there was quite a lot of unity within the revolution in 1789, and they, after all, were able to pass a spectacular series of major enactments. And that what happened in 1790-91 is that some of those who went along with Mirabeau, and including to some extent Sieyès, who is another one who was accused, Camille Desmoulins, for instance, the editor of one of those important papers, who was very much a democratic Republican supporter of Danton, accused Sieyès. The Sieyès is this, because Sieyès was supporting a measure which failed in the National Assembly to restrict full freedom of the press, or to put some restrictions at least on freedom of the press. Sieyès supported. Is this the Sieyès that we work with in 1789? No, Sieyès has changed his position. And there was a widespread perception that a number of key people, Lafayette and Sieyès, had moved somewhat to the right in 1790-91, were joining the centrists, whereas they worked more with the Democratic Republicans in 1789.
Thank you. I just want to ask my own question now, which is, I did read a book on Condorcet, Emil Rothschild's Economic Sentiments, which I found extremely fascinating, and how Condorcet was eventually, he, like Adam Smith, were sort of, particularly Adam Smith, but we're both on the same page when it came to free trade, issues of free trade, when it came to certain commodities like grain and things of that matter. But eventually those ideas were appropriated over time by the conservative right. And it's an interesting how they turned Adam Smith and by definition,
yes. That's very true. It's certainly the case that Adam Smith and Condorcet shared quite a lot, and that both, in an important way, represented, they wanted more economic freedom in an age when there were a lot of privileges, monopolies, restrictions on trade, and so on. They wanted all that stuff cleared away. That's absolutely true. But there's a very important difference that Condorcet was saying, well, we want economic freedom within the context of a democratic constitution in which everyone is equal before the law. Whereas Adam Smith was saying, and this is something that I know in this country there are lots and lots of enthusiasts for Adam Smith. What they forget is that, firstly, Adam Smith didn't think that he wanted more economic freedom. He didn't think that capitalists were very good people to entrust society to, and didn't think they should be represented in the government or in parliament, because they only think about their own interest and not about the social interest. And Adam Smith, in a way, belongs to the Ancien Régime much more than Condorcet does, although the enthusiasts for Adam Smith today don't realize this, but if you read his sections on aristocracy, he thought it's true that the aristocracy run England and Scotland, but they're more public-spirited and more generous class than the capitalists. So that's good, because if the capitalists were in charge, we would be in a worse position. So Adam Smith was actually a supporter of aristocratic dominance of British politics as part of this framework which would shore up economic freedom. So this is a scenario which isn't modern at all, actually. And Condorcet is a much more modern social theorist in many respects, I think, than Adam Smith was.
Well, on this note, thank you so much, and thank you for a great session.